Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the Psychedelic Insider Series, fireside chats with industry leaders in the psychedelic space.
Okay. How are you, Matthew?
Good. How are you, Jason?
I'm doing well. So I'm here with Dr. Matthew Johnson, professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Johnson is one of the world's most published scientists on the human effects of psychedelics and has conducted seminal research in the behavioral economics of drug use, addiction, and risk behavior. How was that?
Sounds great.
All right, cool.
I won't deny that. That was me.
Seminal. I use the word seminal.
It's a fancy word. It
is. All right. So yeah, it's nice to speak with you. I guess maybe my first question for you would be, why psychedelics? How did you get started and why?
Yeah. So more broadly, my work focuses on and has in my fascination ever since really college has focused on psychopharmacology. In other words, drugs, psychoactive drugs and behavior, drugs in the mind, how these drugs, whether they're legal, illegal, whether they're medications, whether they're so-called recreational drugs, drugs of abuse, whatever. If it's psychoactive, I have this profound fascination. Like, how can these molecules affect the mind? I mean, even something as seemingly simple as caffeine, how in the world can, someone ingest, one of these substances and have this effect on the way they feel, on their behavior. And I like to say, if you're interested in that general area of drugs and behavior or psychopharmacology, either you have to be fascinated by the psychedelics, or you don't know much about them, because they're the most fascinating drug class in terms of altering people's behavior. I mean, where else do you see stories anecdotes where people say they took a drug one time and it completely changed their life for the positive? I mean, sometimes you get some examples of, someone got drunk one time and they got in a horrible car accident. So there's some really bad things that can happen from one time of using a drug. They use some cocaine and have a stroke, but in terms of someone saying that they used a drug that had this profoundly positive impact on their life from a single use, that's pretty much just the psychedelics, particularly the classic psychedelics like psilocybin mushrooms or LSD.
Right. Yeah, I suppose if you're going to be interested in that subject, psychedelics would be something that would pique your curiosity.
Right.
Yeah,
it's roots in at every level, the history in our culture, and also by indigenous societies. It's this ancient use of these compounds there's evidence of, and the chemistry, the brain pharmacology, the effects on therapeutics. It's like, I mean, gosh, the work that, like I said, even the CIA was doing with these compounds decades ago, which was very nefarious. It's like you couldn't ask for a more interdisciplinary, fascinating topic area that just cuts across so many distinct, academic disciplines.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that's a good segue, because I was going to ask about kind of the physiology of it. We hear things that it's a serotonin receptor agonist. And so, I mean, as someone who covers the space, I have to admit I have a sort of very rudimentary understanding of what's going on. And maybe you could give us a brief kind of like 101. I mean, we cover the news and we hear about a lot of, the word serotonin receptor, and then we hear about the default mode network. And I don't know if you could enlighten us with a minute or so to say, what's going on when we're talking about these things here.
Right. Well, one of the first things to point out is that there's not one easy answer in terms of how do psychedelics work. There are multiple layers of analysis. So, one layer is you can call receptor pharmacology. What receptor does the molecule bind to? and have an effect on. And that's when we talk about, it's an agonist at the serotonin 2A receptor. Basically means, people probably heard of serotonin. So it's one of the primary neurotransmitters or neuromodulators in the brain. There's a variety of subtypes of receptors that serotonin binds to, all with different effects. One subtype is serotonin. It's called serotonin 2A, and it happens to be this type of receptor that the psychedelics bind to. It serves a major computational role in the brain. There's still a lot of mystery around what this receptor does outside of psychedelic use, but it does have this major computational role in where it's located. But
when you say computational, what do you mean?
It seems to modulate the activity of other brain activity, modulate the activity of other neurotransmitters and other brain activity. So it's really sort of plays this kind of very high level role in coordinating the nervous system, the brain. We can talk about then after the receptor level effects, like these intracellular signaling cascades, which gets really into the weeds. The ways in which the psychedelic compounds affect that neuron in a way that serotonin itself does not, because serotonin is not psychedelic, obviously. But then we get to effects on other neurotransmitter systems, such as there's downstream effects on glutamate, another neurotransmitter system, aside from serotonin, and then we get to sort of the brain activation level or deactivation, and then probably more importantly we get to this level of what are the effects in terms of synchronizing the activity across different brain regions. So it's less about whether this area is active or not. It's more about what is the relationship between activity across areas. And what that tells you, why that's important, is that's really a proxy for communication. If you see that two areas are moving and grooving together, like, they're both active at the same time, they're both sort of, staying quiet at the same time, that tells you that they're communicating. There are neuronal paths between them, and we know that in terms of studying the structure, that are, coordinating activity amongst them. And so something you alluded to was the effects in brain network dynamics. A lot's been made out of it. In brain network dynamics means this coordination amongst brain areas. A lot's been made out of the effects in the default mode network. That's an area, a group of areas brain areas that normally, when someone is daydreaming or thinking about the future, there's normally this increased activity, this synchronization amongst these areas. And when you administer psychedelic, that activity is decoupled, or there's less synchronization. There's some concern about that, though. In fact, other drugs, such as amphetamine or THC, even alcohol, will cause a decoupling of the default mode network. So I'm not convinced that this is sort of any unique signature or key psychedelic mechanism. I think more broadly, it is convincing that psychedelics prompt broad-based network-level changes, both in terms of increasing the activity, increasing communication across areas that don't normally communicate, but also in certain areas like the default mode network, decreasing communication amongst areas that more normally communicate with each other. So it really kind of scrambles up the brain in a way such that the neighbors that normally talk to each other more often don't do so much, anymore, at the expense of they're talking to
other thing.
Distance. It's like now you're talking to, instead of your next door neighbors, the people that live across the city, more often.
Yeah. I mean, and as you get educated, the internet and YouTube seems to be doing a lot of educating for people who are interested in psychedelics. And kind of what we've heard is like the default network would be maybe where, if the ego were to be placed somewhere in the brain, it would be perhaps found in the default network, or the idea of the self and the idea of the ego. Would that be found there? And the kind of common perception of things is that's perhaps why we have these effects after a psychedelic trip of like stepping outside your body, of being more connected with nature. And is that kind of accurate-ish?
That's the part I'm a bit skeptical of. I think the story is a bit too simple. You know,
Right.
If the default mode network is the embodiment of the so-called ego, then if we see it becomes less active, aha, that's the ego
Equals
loss.
less ego.
That explains. But again, it doesn't really jive with the idea that you also see that same type of effect when someone's drunk.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may be a signature, you know,
Well,
not necessarily specific to ego loss, but just not feeling like yourself.
Right.
In the way that, you know, if someone's really drunk, they don't feel
Yeah.
like their normal self, or if they're, you know, high on any number of drugs. And there is this picture emerging that being high on any number of drugs can cause the same type of decoupling in the default mode network. And neuroscientists will differ in terms of whether they would agree with that characterization that the default mode network is the embodiment of the ego. I mean, it appears to play a role in self-referential processing. Mm-hmm. So it seems to be that the coordination in those areas seems to be more active when people are engaging in autobiographical memories, or thinking about themselves in the past, or thinking about what they're going to do in the future. So it has something to do with self-processing. It may or may not be a leap to then call that the ego, which can come with some baggage. It has Freudian roots, which, you know, it may not, you know, entail all of what that can mean.
Yeah, that is a simplistic view. I mean, the idea of the self and the mechanisms of the brain are both too complicated to just be like, oh, there it is, let's just turn it off.
Right. And there's a long history of that in brain research that, you know, usually it's usually not one brain area that's, you know, solely in charge of something. It might play a more prominent role, but, you know, the brain is so interactive. It's hard to,
okay, that was a nice introduction to the brain. Maybe we could start a series of, you know, Dr. Johnson teaches us about the brain. So like moving on into some like recent news, you've been you're a psychedelic superstar.
Well, I don't know if that's an official title, but I mean, I've been lucky to you know, have had some, I think, you know, really promising work that's you know, gotten some attention, and, you know, I'm part of a great group here at Johns Hopkins that's been doing this work for 20 years. So and the interest in the field is like just obviously increasing exponentially. So it's it's really lucky to be in my position.
Yeah, and as someone in the industry, and I care about the growth and the progress and the health of this work. So it's really great to have an institution like Johns Hopkins behind it. I think it lends credibility, and it's really going to like accelerate things, and not just in the science, but then in the public perception, and the two kind of go hand in hand. Like, you know, we're not going to get anywhere until we can get kind of regulatory approval, and just having that name behind it adds some heft to it. And I think that's really gonna, so yeah, we appreciate the work being done, and you guys are definitely like moving things along. So
yeah, thank you.
Kudos. So in recent news, I guess the most recent news was the federal grant for studying, is it psilocybin for smoking cessation?
Right. That's right. Yeah. So that's a line of research I initiated in 2008, and we ran this very small pilot study for a number of years, published it in 2014, just a small open label pilot, but wildly successfully high quit rates that remained, long term. So just 80% of people were biologically verified abstinent at 6 months, and at 2.5 years, it was 60% biologically verified abstinent. And this just absolutely dwarfs the best results that have been published in science. It was an early finding, and there wasn't a control group. We only had a little bit of money to study this. It was a first stab to test the waters, but boy, did it look promising.
Yeah.
We've now moved on to what's called a randomized comparative efficacy trial. It's not blinded. It's still an open label study, but it meaning people know, whether they're getting the psilocybin or not. It's not like a placebo-controlled study, but they're randomized to get either the nicotine patch, the standard way one uses a nicotine patch to quit smoking, versus the psilocybin, a single session, both with cognitive behavioral therapy, sort of the standard talk therapy to quit smoking, and we use that in our pilot. But we use that in our pilot, as well as this ongoing study that's nearly completed. But with the ongoing study and the pilot study, we applied to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is part of NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which is the primary arm of the U.S. Government that funds research, medical research. We put the grant in and received a really stellar score. Actually, the best. I mean, I've applied for dozens and dozens of grants from NIDA and have been lucky to receive a number throughout my career. I received the best score of my scientific career. You had to go through 2 steps, though. You not only have to convince the scientific reviewers, who are folks like myself, scientists that NIH pulls in to get together to review these grants, but then you could have a perfect score, but then it could still be passed over by a perfect score, but it still can be passed over by NIH if they choose not to fund it.
Right.
So we got this really great score, and it took a little bit. The first cycle that it was eligible for, NIDA passed over it, but in the second cycle, the next funding cycle, they decided to fund it. And so what this would fund is a double-blind trial, a multi-site double-blind trial. So now we're kind of moving up the rigor of the research. So
definitely.
This is, with a placebo control, randomized group design, and across 3 different sites. So we can really look, how robust. Is it something special that happens just somehow at Johns Hopkins because we're lucky, or do something a certain way? Or is it replicable at these, at these additional 2 sites at New York University and the University of Alabama at Birmingham? So that's the funding. And as far as we know, this is the first federal funding of a classic psychedelic treatment study since the earlier era of psychedelic research that ended in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's been a half century since the U.S. government has actually directly funded a treatment study with one of these classic psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD. Yeah,
that's really huge. It goes to show like a kind of paradigm shift that's beginning to happen. And I guess the fact that you had such a stellar score, but didn't get past that last stage of approval, but now you are. I mean, it's showing the incremental. I mean, that's kind of a subjective decision. They have to decide if they want to fund this or not, and put the government's backing behind such a thing. And the fact that they didn't, and now that they have, it shows progress.
Right. And I think it's completely understandable. I mean, there's a part of what I mentioned earlier that's fascinating about this stuff is the history. I mean, there's a crazy history, including its history in research, and then it led to, when LSD became more popular on the street, there were a number of casualties. There was some reckless research. Most researchers were very responsible, but history tends to remember some of the more reckless researchers. Yeah. But and
then it ran into the culture wars at that time, and
exactly. So it's very understandable that the federal government has been hesitant to fund this research, but I think the time is right. A lot of people, their first thought is like, wow, how do you get this research past the the DEA or the FDA. And actually, those organizations, even though the process is pretty slow and it can be improved for sure, the speed. But if you have the right credentials and you cross your T's and you dot your I's, the field has been able to get approval from the FDA and the DEA for 20 years now. It's the funding side of the government, the NIH, that's been for a long time now the last of the party, and so now they're there. But I think it makes sense because I don't think it's a risky move on their part. I think there's 20 years of data and thousands of participants across the world now.
Yeah.
Showing that you can, yes, there's dangers to these drugs like there is to any powerful tool, but you can address those in carefully conducted research, and the results are too good not to follow up on. I mean, yeah, they may hold up and they may not, and sometimes early success is found with new therapies where, the subsequent results aren't quite as good as the original. That's research, that's science, that's what we need to follow the data, but so far, the data are absolutely screaming to be followed up on with some real funding. I mean,
they're hard to ignore.
Yeah, and we're in the midst of like a suicide crisis and a drug.
Mental health crises across the board. Yeah.
Right, and we talk about the opioid epidemic, which is very real, but in fact, far more people die of smoking. It's part of this larger. I mean, it's been found that. That in the last several years, that lifespan for United States white adults, for the first time since it's been recorded, lifespan is decreasing rather than increasing, as it had been in all the previous decades. And the two reasons are substance use and suicide, which is obviously related to depression. And what are we seeing great promise in with psychedelic therapy?
Yep.
Substance use disorders.
Yeah.
And depression.
Yeah.
So, there's a real risk, an ethical liability to looking
to
at
not pursue these things
and not pursuing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a risk of endorsing the research, but there's a growing risk of like keeping your head in the sand.
It seems like the risk is greater to not pursue it than,
I think so.
Yeah. And I wonder if a thought that came to mind is the fact that we have to overcome decades and decades of cultural taboo and scientific kind of blacklisting. And I wonder if does it add rigor? Are we being more careful? And the fact that we've had this kind of dark age of not being able to pursue it, are we being extra careful now? Like the studies and the science that you guys are undertaking now, is it more rigorous than it was back in the 50s when we were taking LSD? Is the fact that we know there's a skeptical eye watching that will, one reckless scientist could ruin this whole ride for us all. So I wonder if the fact that we're stepping away from such a long period, is this adding, are we doing this better? Is a thought that came to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very clear. You're exactly right. I mean, we have this kind of paranoia in the field that's kind of pervasive, which is a functional paranoia maybe, but of that one, the one, if you're not doing things right, something, especially it can be sensationalistic. And even if it's some negative event that might pop up in another research area that might be addressed, maybe things weren't done right in that particular instance and there could be corrections. The fear is that that there might be an overreaction here and the whole field could be shut down. I mean, one aspect of this is this. I've made a focus of my career to focus on the dark side. I mean, my first author publication in the area was on the risks of psilocybin and other classic psychedelics and how you can address those risks safely in the lab, reviewing that older research going back to the 50s on how to safely administer these and reduce those risks to an acceptable level. So I think it's a good thing. I don't give a talk without mentioning that, there's the bad trip. There's the, people who with psychotic disorders could be destabilized, this type of thing that we just need to be very clear about. And I think that's good,
it is.
That there are casualties. Sometimes people who use on their own in an unsafe setting end up getting hurt. Even if it's the minority of cases, it's still, it happens, and it shouldn't be surprising. These are very powerful substances with profound effects on the mind.
Yeah, and this kind of careful view of things. Oh, I think I may have.
Yeah, you're back.
I'm back now? All right, cool.
Yeah.
I think this kind of careful approach will. I mean, one of the issues is, how is the industry going to develop? Are we going to just go the big pharma route and make some pills and have people pop in psychedelic pills, or is it going to be this kind of more holistic approach, having therapy involved? And it seems right now, as I'm seeing the players in the industry who are building this thing up, it seems they have this careful, thoughtful, holistic approach to the therapy. And I guess this kind of careful view of things is spilling over into the industry for now, and that's probably a good thing, because the more careful we are, and the better we do this, we're building the foundations of the future of the industry and the therapy. So it seems like this careful approach, although people would like things to go faster, it may work out in the long run.
Oh, I think so, because I mean, there's a good reason to be risk averse. Because folks know, I mean, hey, it's not only a risk to the individual, patient, if you're cutting corners, but it's, hey, if you're a company developing this through the FDA pathway, it's a risk to your business model.
Yep.
You don't want to be on the front page of the paper with a casualty because you didn't do things right. I mean, that's you're not going to succeed. And I really think that, I mean, gosh, all of the evidence points to the fact that you really get these dramatically impressive effects under these conditions where it's not just, taking the pill and without, you need the professional support, the therapeutic intent, the follow-up care, this whole package that really, I mean, we've conducted, studies with hundreds of participants, some of which have had previous psychedelic experience, and amongst those people who have had, say, it's night and day compared to the typical, using with friends, even if it's not the most reckless of circumstances. Still, when you have this sort of introspective, professionally supported experience, it's quite different, and that's really where the power is at. So I also understand it's an expensive treatment model, but I think that actually helps to pay for itself when you actually get very good results.
Yes.
And the other thing is, there are ways to address that. I think more work needs to be done looking at group work, with the right, that would,
definitely
that would, reduce the cost, things like that. To be cautious as you kind of modify those risk, those mitigating strategies, to be very cautious. And if you observe something that's concerning, then you might kind of reverse that, but I think it would be very reasonable to explore strategies such as group therapy, this type of thing.
I've spoken to that. I mean, I recently had a conversation with Ronan Levy of Field Trip, and they're obviously trying to accessibility is going to be an issue, right? And we don't want this to be an elitist kind of thing. So groups
There's a risk
therapy.
to this actually not getting to people.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Or to have a treatment that's so expensive that no insurance will cover it, no payers will cover it, and only rich people get it. I mean, one of the things, there's a balance. I mean, one of the things I'm concerned about is like over regulation, such as like, oh gosh, if the FDA were to require in practice something like, at the worst, sort of 2 doctoral level clinicians, 2 physicians in the room with, I mean, you're talking about the most expensive treatment model possible. And it's like, you need a physician on the treatment team, you need physician oversight and there to respond, and you need screening with the appropriate medical professionals, but you don't necessarily need a physician in the room, during the treatment. I mean, I think sort of and we've had experience with hundreds of folks with a number of guides. I mean, a good master's level therapist, can really excel in that role.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like the industry is taking this into consideration, and kind of the therapist's bottleneck is an issue that people are trying to address right now. And hopefully, if we can show the powers that be that there is a pool of capable therapists who can help. I mean, I'm not sure how the approval process works there, but the fact that we're addressing it this early on, it may remove the risk of the FDA being too stringent on future approvals.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So moving on, so the grant study, that's great news. This is like, it's really seminal for it's going to be a milestone, looking back that the government has approved and funded something like this. And another recent piece of news that you were involved in is Midason's study. I believe it was a phase 2, phase 3, and Johns Hopkins and yourself are involved in this seamless study. Is that correct?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, we entered into a broader research agreement where we're going to be exploring a number of research projects that they would fund and we would conduct that are still to be worked out. So it's sort of this broader kind of like relationship, this commitment. But in addition to that, more specifically is working with them, moving towards phase 2, phase 3 research, really for smoking cessation, moving it towards FDA approval in their hands as a sponsor. And so this is sort of the same line of research as our recent NIH funding. The studies wouldn't be identical; they would be complementary. So I think it would, absolutely overall, make for a better case. It's more data, it's more safety data, it's more efficacy data, and we're exploring.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. No, finish your thought.
We're exploring ways now to just set things up such that they maximize that synergistic and complementary nature.
Mm-hmm. So the FDA does take the whole of the concept into consideration. It's not specifically results from the trial. If there's supporting evidence around this, they take that into consideration.
Yeah. I mean, you do need the critical and the key thing once you move to phase 3. I mean, that's the results are the results, and in both in terms of safety and efficacy. But getting there, and in terms of just their overall evaluation, absolutely, they take into account all of the research that gets you there and that justifies that final step. So yeah, and especially seeing research conducted under I think differing designs. By different groups. I mean, it adds to the robustness when you see a finding, especially when you see a finding that results in a really big effect. It's like, okay, is something screwy happening here? Is it just, like,
got it?
Are they making up the data, or are they just such gifted therapists that it's working well in their hands and not in anyone else's hands, or they set up the study in this very peculiar way that somehow it looks better than it is. So, by having a variety of study designs, a variety of groups that are conducting the research, this all adds to this overall evaluation. If you can consistently see very promising results under all of these variations, that really tells you a lot. And yeah, the FDA takes that full account into consideration.
Yeah, well, that's good because there's supporting evidence popping up all around the place. So this specific study, is this a follow-up to was it 2014 that you published the smoking cessation evidence? Right.
That was the pilot study with 15 people. So it's a follow-up to that and a follow-up to the study that we are currently running that we're mostly through with, but it's not completed yet. But we had enough of those data, more than half of that trial completed as part of the body of evidence that we presented in order to apply for this newer study. So we have this ongoing randomized comparative efficacy, which is again not blinded, so people know if they're randomized to the psilocybin group or the nicotine patch group. But it has the value of really comparing it to something that we know works. It works, patch works better than placebo. There's tons of studies that support that. There's tons of room for improvement with patch and everything else on the market, but nonetheless, it works better than nothing. We solidly know that. So it's a known standard, and so we'll see how it works. And we're also in the current study testing it under the conditions that actually mirror the way it's going to look like in the real world if it's approved. In other words, it is kind of weird, and I've been in countless sessions as a guide, and I know in double-blind studies it's kind of bizarre. You've prepared this person for this this intense experience, and you'd let them know this could be one of the most intense experiences of your life. This could be. We've had people that say this is the most frightening experience of their life. And we prepare them for this, what could be, and then the person's laying on the couch and in a
got the placebo.
They're like, they could have nothing happen. Now we try to discourage you. Like, just focus on your experience. Don't worry about get caught up.
These mushrooms are bullshit.
But it's a particularly weird thing compared to other blinded aspects of medicine, where you go into this trial thinking this could be one of the biggest experiences of your life, or it could just be this, kind of a boring day on the couch. So you are modeling something that's kind of peculiar. So I do, in the current study, we're seeing psilocybin in a randomized study as the way it would be used if it's approved. You're going to get 30 milligrams of psilocybin today. Versus randomized people to get the standard course of nicotine patch treatment with the same cognitive behavioral therapy. Same talk therapy for both. So, so that, but you do need, with all the caveats I said about the blinded research, you need that because, again, the best answer comes from across different types of study. Every study design has its weaknesses and its strengths. And whether we like it or not, the double-blind study has a special place in the approval of medicine. We need double-blind research in, phase 3, moving towards phase 3. So this is a really key step, so this next step is going to be this double-blind research.
Right. And just lastly, I was just wondering how this works. So like an approval for the approval process, Midocin doesn't need to have started from the phase 1. They can kind of jump in on your preclinical and earlier phase stuff and then kind of jump in at a phase 2, phase 3, or do they need to have to have been like their molecule all the way through the process, or are they jumping in here at a later stage based on your previous research?
So I believe one can jump in at a later phase, and the devil is always in the details when it comes to these things. But and part of that is working with the FDA, and part of that might be showing a functional equivalence in the product to what has been used previously.
Right.
So but it's
because Michael. You go ahead.
I mean, so the two entities that have moved forward into phase 2B trials and are planning phase 3 trials using psilocybin for depression, for major depressive disorder, both Compass Pathways and the USONA Institute, the primary data from their work, it came from moving into phase 2B came from our lab and the other labs at UCLA and NYU who had conducted the 3 double-blind studies. I'm looking at both depression and anxiety in cancer patients, and all the studies found these large reductions in depression. So, that was a case where the product differed. I mean, we were using a product that Dave Nichols made as a chemist when he was at Purdue University, so not a commercial product, but pure, psilocybin, probably the cleanest psilocybin on the planet because he's a hell of a chemist. But they were able to leverage those data to move forward with their products, their psilocybin products into phase 2B research.
Got it. So Midocin's Myco-001 is a naturally derived psilocybin. So I guess they were able to show an equivalence to your previous psilocybin studies, and that allowed them to jump in with their product at a later stage.
So I think, and all of this is in process. So I think that, I don't want to speak to what has been, to the particular, steps there, but that's, Yeah, that may be
the general gist of it.
Right. Yeah, and,
All right.
and frankly, like scientifically, if it's psilocybin, it's psilocybin, right? I mean,
yeah,
and it's gonna, I mean, to the scientist, if you do indeed have a pure product, I would be astonished if the results didn't hold up. Yeah.
I guess perhaps in the future when we start talking about second and third generation. Oh, I'm gone. Did I disappear?
Into a little cat for a second.
Yeah, I saw that.
Now you're back.
Right.
Yeah,
I'm back. Was that my microdose kicking in? No. Okay. So
it might be more than a microdose.
Yeah, right.
It happens when people aren't careful.
Turn into a cat. When
you turn into a cat, it might be more than a microdose.
It might be a macro. Yeah. I lost my thought.
That's all right. Blame the microdose again.
Yeah, exactly. I had it. All right. We'll end on that note. So I appreciate the time. This was great. And we may see each other at Wonderland Miami. You're going to be speaking at
Very
Microdoses. Cool. You're going to be speaking there?
Yes. Yep. I will be there.
Oh, shit.
Here you are.
Shit. Oh,
the microdose and cat again.
All right. All right. Let's call this before anything else happens.
Well, I will see you there then in Miami.
Yes, you will. I appreciate this, Matthew, and keep up the good work.
All right. Thanks, Jason. Enjoy the conversation.
Thanks for joining the Psychedelic Insider series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.